Chapter 5, Mishnah 10. Most of the discussions of this chapter have been based on the principle that we cannot separate tithes, trumas and maasros, from what is exempt on behalf of what is obligated, or from what is obligated on behalf of what is exempt. The next two Mishnahs continue this discussion in regard to tithing produce that is biblically obligated in tithes for produce that is only rabbinically obligated, or the other way around. Since produce that is only rabbinically subject to these obligations is exempt from them on the biblical level, tithing from one for the other is another example of tithing from what is exempt on behalf of what is obligated, or from what is obligated on behalf of what is exempt. The next two Mishnahs teach that the law for situations in which someone went ahead and tithed rabbinically obligated produce for biblically obligated produce, or the other way around. This Mishnah begins with the example of produce that grows in flower pots. Such produce is sometimes biblically obligated in tithes, and sometimes only rabbinically obligated. We now turn to the words of the Mishnah. Produce grown in a flower pot that has a hole in it is like produce grown in the ground, because the plant draws nourishment from the ground beneath it through the hole. It is thus subject to the requirements of trumas and maasros even under biblical law. Therefore, if someone separated truma from produce that grew from the ground for produce that grew in a flower pot with a hole, or from produce that grew in a flower pot with a hole for produce that grew from the ground, his truma is valid truma, since there is no legal difference between the produce of the ground and the produce of the flower pot with a hole in it. Unlike the produce of a flower pot with a hole, the produce of a flower pot that does not have a hole in it is not considered as growing from the ground. The tithing obligation for whatever grows in such a pot is only rabbinic. This leads to the following rules. If he separated truma from the produce of a flower pot without a hole for the produce of a flower pot with a hole, which means that he separated truma from produce that is biblically exempt on behalf of produce that is biblically obligated in tithes, what he separated is treated as truma, i.e., it must be given to a Kohen like ordinary truma. But he must separate truma again to permit what grew in the flower pot with the hole, since his first truma was not effective on the biblical level. The reverse case, if he separated truma from the produce of a flower pot with a hole for the produce of a flower pot without a hole, which means that he separated truma from biblically obligated produce on behalf of produce that is biblically exempt, what he separated is treated as truma and must be given to a Kohen. But since it is still tevel on the biblical level, it may not be eaten by the Kohen until the owner takes out trumas and maasros for it.